Hi, and welcome. My name is James Nate Huntley. I'm a licensed clinical social worker practicing in Denver, Colorado. And this is my podcast, the Turtle Shell Therapy Institute. So in this first episode, I'm going to mostly be talking about my hope for this show, what you all can expect in each episode, and talk about my background and why I'm even qualified to talk about these topics. So the podcast is designed to help you feel comfortable inside and outside of your shell. That's the mission of the Turtle Shell Therapy Institute. So this podcast is going to do that by sharing current attachment and emotion science. We're going to discuss different kinds of therapies, interventions, and strategies that can help you towards mental wellness and better self-understanding. Some episodes will just be me talking about these things, and others, I'll bring on guests to share their knowledge and experience on the topics. For me specifically, trauma and attachment are my areas of specialty, so we'll definitely be talking a lot about those. So, welcome to the Institute. So based on my experience as a social worker for the last 14 years, really my philosophy around mental health and trauma is that trauma is anything that negatively impacts our views of ourselves, others, or the world. And when we're thinking about attachment, in simple terms, it basically describes how we learn to exist in a relationship. So that's to say, how do we get our needs met? How do we protect ourselves physically and emotionally? A lot of people will be familiar with the different attachment styles. That's kind of the big thing that comes up with attachment. So the three primary attachment styles are secure, anxious, and avoidant. There's also disorganized. That occurs when there's significant trauma. I'll make an episode talking about that later in the show. We're also going to get into how complex attachment is, and especially when we start getting into like adult attachment, there's language that you'll be hearing there. Won't really get into all that today, but that's something you can look forward to in later episodes. I also have a guided journal that I recently published last year, December 2022. It talks a lot about this, how you usually learn to use different attachment strategies depending on the person, the context of the relationship, and your past experiences with similar people and relationships. A lot of people think that like your attachment style is just your attachment style, but it's actually a little more fluid than that. And it isn't necessarily like good attachment, bad attachment. Secure and insecure is more about what did we need to do to, like I said before, get our needs met to feel safe in a relationship. And sometimes we did develop some anxious strategies or some avoidance strategies. They're not necessarily bad per se. They just don't work in a lot of different contexts of relationships. But again, stuff to look forward to in later episodes that I'll get more into. Okay, so my background. Why should you listen to me? Why should you care? I've been a social worker since 2009 and a clinical social worker since 2013. So what is a social worker? A lot of people have different ideas of it. A lot of times when I meet people, they immediately think of somebody who works with the homeless, does casework, maybe works with adoption or child protection, welfare. And those are all things that social workers do, absolutely. But it's so much broader than that too. So if I explain it, social work, it's a lot of things, but to try and sum it up in a sentence, our work centers around social justice. And so that encompasses a lot of different things. So I have this definition from the United Nations. Social justice is the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. Social workers aim to open the doors of access and opportunity for everyone, particularly those in greatest need. So social workers, we are advocates, we are researchers, we are mental health clinicians, we are lobbyists, we are community organizers, we are historians. It's a really broad field of study, but our education involves all of these different things that I just listed. And it is its own degree. A lot of people ask me if I have a sociology degree, and no, my bachelor's is in social work, as is my master's. My master's is in social work. So once I got my bachelor's of social work, I let's see. Yeah, I started out as a school social worker, did like a short stint of that for a year, and then went to work for a nonprofit organization where I was a caseworker for about 2 years, overseeing personal care services for children and adults living with physical, intellectual, and emotional disabilities. I went to graduate school and earned my master's in social work from there. During the years before graduate school, I worked a lot around advocating for equitable policies and learned a lot about Medicaid and Medicare, the private insurance systems, and the intersection of politics. That was, that was a big part of my job working at the nonprofit center. And it's what sparked my interest in getting my master's, because I felt pretty limited in what I could do with my bachelor's, and then wanted to get my master's degree. So my clinical placement during graduate school was actually at a clinic that provided mental health services specifically for kids and adults on the autism spectrum, and that had other neurological differences, as well as their caregivers. There were services for them as well. I learned a lot about neurodivergence there, cognitive therapies. That was kind of my basis in therapy at the time. I learned a lot about funding streams and continue to learn how policy influences basically everything. From there, I moved to Colorado. I grew up in the Midwest in Wisconsin, so I was working and going to graduate school in the Twin Cities, but then moved to Colorado, moved to Boulder, and then eventually moved to Denver. When I first moved here, I was providing mental health and behavior therapy to the same population for a few years. So doing like ABA, cognitive behavioral therapy, play-based therapies, those community-based therapies, social skills training, that sort of thing. I did that for a couple of years while working at an inpatient hospital that served teens. It served people who were living with suicide, people living with addiction, and substance dependence, as well as people living with psychosis and severe and persistent mental illness like schizophrenia, living with delusions. I went to community mental health from there and worked in the crisis and in-home therapy program before making the switch to getting trained as an early childhood specialist. So while I was at the community mental health center in both roles, throughout that time, this is where I got a good bulk of my training working with trauma, human development. This is where I got trained in EMDR, which, I will talk more about actually later today in the episode, about just how it's a trauma treatment and how it works. And when I say trauma, again, it's anything that negatively changes your view of yourself, the others, or the world. So it's a pretty broad definition. So I've just found EMDR can help with a lot of things. Once I left the Community Mental Health Center, I did continue as an early childhood mental health consultant through a grant that the city of Denver had through a local public health system. I just got a lot of great training from that. I was just so thankful for that experience. A lot of training on trauma and attachment theory, how it impacts the brain and human development. And then how do attachment and trauma inform therapies? How can they help people, heal from trauma and attachment wounds? So from there, I started my private practice, Turtle Shell, continued providing EMDR, got more advanced trainings around that, got certified, mostly working with trauma survivors. And then I also got trained in emotionally focused therapy, which is attachment-based therapy that helps relationships. So I was working with couples, consensual non-monogamous relationships, polyamorous relationships, and then I was also working with families. Having a solo private practice during the pandemic, that was definitely one of the biggest growing edges I've had in my professional life and personal life. Sitting with people while we both go through one of the most uncertain, dark times in recent history was definitely an experience. I plan on having an episode just kind of talking about that too. So currently, I provide EMDR and emotionally focused therapy at the Road Less Travel Counseling Center in Denver. I mostly work with people who have lived through attachment traumas, so abusive relationships, abuse from childhood, assault, and mass event survivors. I work primarily with queer people, neurodivergence, and people who just, feel like they don't really fit and are unworthy of happiness. Like I said, I am certified in EMDR and working on becoming a consultant, which means, trying to get into training, helping other therapists grow and develop as EMDR therapists. I provide EMDR consultation to other therapists at this practice as well. Additionally, I also sit on a steering committee for emotionally focused therapists in Denver. We help the community of therapists and provide or offer training. So we find people who will offer trainings and provide a platform for them to train emotionally focused trained therapists in the local area. And then we also try to have events just to bring in community, bring us all together and just be able to kind of talk. And because again, being a therapist can be very lonely at times and feel very isolating. So that community aspect is really important, even within therapists. Like I mentioned, I recently published a guided journal called the Attachment Theory Journal. It's available everywhere that books are sold. And then when I joined the group, I converted the Turtle Shell, my private practice, into the Turtle Shell Therapy Institute that's focused on sharing knowledge and current research to help people better understand their mental health and how to gain mental wellness. And that's what brings us here. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about EMDR, that I'm certified in it. I'm becoming a consultant in it. So let me talk a little bit about what it is. So EMDR is a trauma therapy that was discovered in the 1980s by a doctor of psychology named Francine Shapiro. It's an evidence-based therapy, which means there's a good amount of research showing evidence that it is effective, specifically in treating trauma. So I mostly practice attachment-focused EMDR. So there are some differences between the standard EMDR, but I personally don't think it's too terribly different, in my opinion. There is a bit more talking and putting words to feelings that you didn't have words to before or you weren't able to say. As an example, you might need to make some adaptations because attachment trauma tends to be a lot more, well, the things kind of seem a lot more subtle. There's these big themes that will come up, but then they're all connected by these little experiences and these little feelings. So it does involve a lot more collaboration, a lot more investigation between the therapist and the client. But I love it. I've been doing it for several years now. But before I get into all of that, let me just explain what basic EMDR is. So it's an 8-phase therapy, and it's all based on something called the AIP model, which stands for Adaptive Information Processing. So this theory says that the brain is just like any other part of the body. It's always trying to heal in some adaptive way. But when trauma occurs, it can be too much, and then it starts to process what happened maladaptively. Which, I put that in quotations, and we can get more into that later. But what it's doing is it's keeping the traumatic experience in the front of mind, generalizing it so that it makes it feel like it's happening again, unless you're hypervigilant, making sure it doesn't happen again. Now, there may not always necessarily be intrusive thoughts or memories. That is a part of post-traumatic stress disorder, but a traumatic experience can also just be like a felt sense or like a feeling. It gets generalized into something, what we would call a memory network, that can go into different beliefs that influence how you interpret what's happening, the automatic thoughts that come up when you're thinking about yourself or others. So for example, if you have a lot of experiences that are feeding this belief that you're not valuable, that could start to become attachment-based trauma, where you just start to just think that all the time. Well, I'm not valuable unless I make myself valuable in some way. And then that can feel really hopeless and maybe develop like people-pleasing habits, those sort of things. So there's 8 phases. It starts off with the clinician and the client getting to know each other. This is sort of the intake portion, history gathering, building rapport with each other, because even though one of the things about EMDR that draws people to it is that it provides results a lot faster than talk therapy usually. And a lot of people like it because it does get into the body. And a lot of people think there isn't a lot of talking in it, which there isn't. There definitely isn't as much talking as traditional talk therapy would have in it. But there is still some talking. But this is the big part where we're gathering history. The therapist and clinician are getting to know each other, and they're building safety and trust with each other. Because again, I'm asking my clients to go into some pretty uncomfortable feelings, and it really helps to do that if they feel safe with me. So that's a really important phase. That phase, from there, then we go into phase 2, which is the preparation phase. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's preparing the client for EMDR. So we develop things called resources, which are different tools that can be used to help you soothe your nervous system, help you calm down, help you when you're feeling dysregulated or really anxious or stressed out. This is really important. These resources are important because once we start the actual reprocessing of the traumatic experience, we don't always know what's going to come up in between sessions or even during sessions. And having a resource, some sort of tool to help soothe your nervous system is just really beneficial, because we're not trying to get you completely out of your comfort zone, or what therapists might call your window of tolerance, the ability to tolerate distress or strong emotion. We want you just at the edge of it, because if we get you out of it, then it's not necessarily going to be therapeutic or helpful. So we want to be able to keep you within that window. And these resources can be really helpful doing that. So some examples of it would be people will create something called a safe place, which is basically like the happy place. It's a visual of a place you can go to. Something called an ally, which is a figure that encourages you and brings on feelings of safety and care and comfort. I like to use something called the tree meditation, where my clients can create a tree that they can go into or even become when they are needing to feel, help with their confidence and help with their stress. And there's so many other ones. So from there, we go into a phase called assessment, which is where I collaborate with my client on, okay, what traumatic memories or experiences or even clinical issues do we really want to focus on? I mean, we definitely talked about it in phase 1 in the history taking, but now we're really focusing it. We draw out what I call a EMDR map, where we can kind of go through, we can kind of assess what things are the most distressing or seem the most prevalent that are impacting their day-to-day. And from there, then we go into phase 4, which is the reprocessing. So that's what a lot of people will see when they're actually learning about EMDR. That's the eye movement, the back and forth, or the tapping. So let me get into some of the neuroscience of what exactly EMDR is. So I had mentioned that AIP model. So imagine you break your arm. Now, your body is going to try to heal, regardless of whether you place the bone or not. And if you don't place the bone, then it's not going to heal adaptively. It's just going to heal how it heals in a way that makes sense. Kind of like we were saying with the traumatic experience, it's so big that now it's just kind of in the forefront of the brain to try to prevent it, but it's not really healing adaptively, which for mental health and trauma, we would say an adaptive process would be not negating. Again, this isn't like some sort of mind altering, trying to make you think that this awful thing that happened was okay. EMDR can't do anything unnatural like that. What it will do, though, is help process any of the shame, maybe even guilt if it's there, but it helps you process that, and it helps focus it more so it isn't so generalized. So for example, if a bone breaks, it's still going to try and heal, whether it gets placed or not. But if it heals without the bone getting placed, then in a sense it's healing maladaptively. It's not going to heal correctly in a way that's going to be very functional. And that's similar to what I was talking about when I was talking about how trauma, it can be too much to process. So then your brain keeps it on the forefront of your mind or integrates in a way where it overgeneralizes. You think that it could happen anywhere at any time and that it's not as contextual. So for example, with a lot of survivors of abuse that I've worked with, they will, what that traumatic experience did, living through that abuse, it created this belief that it will just happen with anyone, anywhere. And that's where that hypervigilance comes, the mistrust of people that we see a lot from survivors of abuse, which makes a lot of sense. And so what EMDR does, it won't do anything unnatural. It's not going to make the person just feel like, oh, I'm okay, that happened, or, trying to see all the strengths or anything like that. It doesn't do that. What it does is it helps you process to realize, things like, one, you didn't deserve that. That was abusive behavior, and that wasn't okay. It's really unfortunate it happened. And not everybody is out to hurt you. It really helps process and make sense, well, as much sense as you possibly can in a situation like that. But the big thing is that it helps process the shame, so that the shame isn't there that keeps us stuck in trauma. It also helps us, try to see different perspectives, because a lot of times when we have a traumatic experience and our brain processes maladaptively, we might miss different perspectives in there. But the big thing is that it does lead to healing, to try and bring down the feelings of low self-worth, the feelings of fear. It's just really cool to watch and to work with, and have had done on myself as well too. That's a big part of the training. So phase 4, what it is doing is we are using bilateral stimulation or dual attention stimulus, either BLS or DAS. You'll hear different therapists use different terms, but they mean the same thing. So the idea is, we don't really know why, but for whatever reason, when we have that bilateral stimulation or that dual attention stimulus, what we're talking about is stimuli that crosses our midline. So, our body is divided into a left side and a right side. So when our eyes move back and forth, that is crossing the midline. That's starting this EMDR process. What we're doing is we're actually replicating the REM sleep process, rapid eye movement. Now you're fully awake, you're fully aware, so I don't want to mislead you there, but we're replicating that same process. And we found that for whatever reason, when we're dreaming, our eyes move back and forth, and that starts to process and integrate information. That's why a lot of our dreams are focused around things that are going on in our lives. Now, when I think of interpreting dreams, I don't necessarily go with the whole you saw a black cat, so it means this. More for me, when I think of interpreting dreams, it's more about the emotional state, and the mind is very metaphorical. So the different representations in our dreams might have usually will have some sort of metaphor specific to us. So for example, a lot of times when I'm feeling really stressed out or feeling like I'm falling behind on things, excuse me, I almost always have this similar recurring dream that's around me being in 8th grade and the bell is ringing and I can't remember my locker combination. And I'm just really, really stressed out because I know I'm going to be late. I know I'm going to get in trouble. And usually that dream almost always is a metaphor for something that I'm feeling behind, whether that's true or not, or that I feel I have a lot on my plate. So if that makes sense, that's kind of how I see dreams. Anyway, how that relates to EMDR is it's a very similar process, but you're awake during it. So we can do eye movements or even tapping. This is also why people who pace or people who go on runs say that they usually feel better, that they process better. They actually do. The walking back and forth is, again, bilateral stimulation or dual attention stimuli. It creates this process where all the parts of the brain start communicating better. And it's almost like, there's a children's book too that describes it as if trauma is like you ate a really big meal that your stomach is having a hard time digesting. The bilateral stimulation, the EMDR helps chew it and digest it better so that you can take what's adaptive and then leave what's not adaptive or helpful. So that's the biggest chunk of EMDR. That's phase 4. That can take several sessions depending on what we're working with. From there, then there's phase 5, which they call installation. This is where we start to use the bilateral stimulation to start to integrate more positive beliefs about yourself, more truths. So we start to see for example, if the traumatic experience you're working with made you believe that you are worthless, then in this one, it might be appropriate then to install a belief that I am worthy, if that feels appropriate for you and for the client. I collaborate with them on that. And then we use the bilateral stimulation actually to install that and to help really integrate how true that is. So that, because a lot of people I work with will know, yeah, I know I'm a person of value. I know I'm worthy. I just don't feel it. So this really helps once we've sort of cleaned out and worked through the trauma. This then helps, it creates space. And then this part of EMDR then helps actually really integrate so that you can feel that, because now there's room for it. Then phase 6, we do something called a body scan, where we just think of the traumatic experience, have the person just kind of go through their body and just notice if anything feels off or not good. And if there is, then we apply bilateral stimulation to that until it goes away, which usually pretty much always does. And then phase 7 is called closure. So then we would close there. So this could be several sessions later. Like we could have met during phase 4 for several sessions. And then a lot of times we do phase 5 and 6 right away. And then phase 7, it would be like, okay, we close, reflect. I guess in a sense, I basically do phase 7 at the end of every session. So I could be like doing reprocessing to phase 4 and then end with phase 7, the closure. So this is what are your big takeaways from today? Help with some grounding. I really like to ground my clients at the end because we can get into some deep, heavy stuff. And I want to try and make sure that they're feeling grounded when they leave. And then the next session would be phase 8, which is reevaluation. How are we feeling today? I start pretty much every session with that, which I know it's confusing, right? Because you would think it would be all like linear, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But I'm saying that I begin each session. Once we get to phase 4, I begin each session with phase 8, go to phase 4. Anyway, it makes more sense when you're doing it. But that's kind of in a nutshell how EMDR therapy works, with explaining some of the background too. So I'm having my clients, when they're going through it, trying to pay attention to their thoughts, their emotions, body sensations. We want to really look at those 3 areas because that's where a lot of the healing is. What I like about EMDR is I feel like a lot of therapies really cover the thoughts and the emotions well, but the body does get missed a lot, and EMDR incorporates all 3. So anyway, that's an explanation of what EMDR is. I just thought it would be important for this first episode to explain that, since that's a major therapy that I use. Well, I have had a lot of fun this first episode, and I really hope you join me for future episodes where we're going to be talking about attachment theory more in depth. I plan on having different guests on to talk about play therapy, parent-child attachment, couples therapy, relationship therapy, romantic relationships. I want to have guests on to talk about family therapy, perinatal mental health, so mental health focused around pregnancy and pre and postpartum after the baby's born. So I have a lot of really cool things planned. And I also plan on talking about anti-racism and how anti-racism can be incorporated into therapy. I have some ideas for some really cool guests who can come and talk about that topic as well. And when I'm talking about attachment too, I'm talking about more than just our family relationships or our romantic partners. I'm also talking about our attachment to our society, how our social identities impact that. So yeah, I really hope to see you back at the Institute again. I am going to try and have this podcast posted at least twice a month, if not every week. I'll do the best I can, but we'll just kind of see what happens from there. But until next time, take care.